So Jamiy has released some new Twitter posts talking about his thoughts on people wanting to input their own advice for trying to make this metagame somewhat better by highlighting the offensive or defensive oppressive threats that are in this metagame. So let's go through each one, and of course I'll give my thoughts on these type of nerfs. Jamiy has explicitly said and made his thoughts very clear that he has very big problems with Gargo defense, as he wants to remove empathize from it. For one, this helps a lot of teams that just struggle with Gargo defense, as Gargo defense has a really good bulk. It can of course set up hazards, driving force them out, and stack up hazard damage in that way, but a lot of people have trouble breaking through it with empathize. Obviously, my thoughts on this is like it's really not too hard, but then again, you are forced to run ice types and just Loomians that are spirit types to try and stop the driving force from Gargoyle defense. And when you really think about it, there's really not a lot of OU offensive Loomians that can just do that. So I do understand where Jamie's coming from with this nerf. So there you go. That's my thoughts on it. And of course, a lot of these Loomians, just a little disclaimer, are going to be losing a lot of moves. Anyways, let's talk about the next Loomian, which is going to be Jalusa losing Deep Freeze. This is a pretty solid addition, I would say, as Jalusa losing Deep Freeze helps a lot of answers swap in on Jalusa. For one, Cleone is a more solid answer even before with Deep Freeze. It's now more of a solid answer. You can use other Jalusas or most namely Luminami in order to stop Jalusa. You can use other bulky waters. There's just a lot of things you want to like with Jalusa. However, losing Deep Freeze doesn't really solve the problem too much, as it's just gonna resort to Frost Beam. Yes, Frost Beam is a worse move type coverage wise, but now the plant types that are gonna be swapping in on it, mainly Totab, Nevermare, all you really want to know as offensive stuff, are really gonna be taking a lot of HP away. Obviously, this really just benefits the bulky waters that can now just swap in on Jalusa, mainly Luminami, and I guess you can argue Gnarly Gash Colossus, but again, Jalusa can try and pivot out if it has Flash and Flee, so this nerf is, I'd say it's well deserved. It really does help with a lot of teams, so I would give this a pretty solid thing. I wouldn't mind this at all. Next up, we have Konics, which finally, we have one. We have one. My Konics Uber video from way back when that talked about many of its oppressive attributes, we have one. And it is losing Spite, Light Speed Ray, and it's going to be swapping out the Prismatic ability, which means it won't be able to absorb light type moves, so it's no longer able to resort to or absorb Flash and Flee. That's pretty solid in my opinion. And yeah, this is overall pretty solid buffs or pretty solid nerfs to Konics. In my opinion, I'm afraid that this is a little too much, because obviously Spite and Light Speed Ray, those two are one of the more oppressive stuff, because Spite forces teams to run metal types with recovery, specifically Valkyrie or Stratosaur, and Light Speed Ray is very oppressive for offensive teams. However, with both of them gone now, I guess that does resort to Konics losing quite a bit of viability. However, this affects both defensive and offensive Konics. It's probably going to resort to something like Tricky Tactics, or maybe even something like Magnify, which it can run on both sets. So it does have some pretty solid backup moves to run up for these loss of moves. However, these are not nearly as good as the others, so pretty solid for that department. Anyways, I do want to talk about a little bit more Loomians. Let me just fix this real quick. First off, I do want to talk about Lampurge, which again, not a lot of people know this, but because of Captivating being really strong in double battles, because the way it works is that any move will be redirected to Lampurge that is targeting your ally, which means any ally can get up to easily +6 or +3, meaning stuff like Mutagon, Gienta, and all of that can just rail through defensive teams and offensive teams in doubles. So Captivating only now working on the first turn, I guess it's fine. Really nothing too worried about here. It's overall just good vibes from this. Nothing too crazy. And then next up we have Gladia, and I'll include Arceros here, and is that they're nerfing their signature regular abilities, decreasing the power to 25%, and of course reducing that percent of energy cost by 25% as well. This is a pretty considerable change specifically to Gladia, or not Gladia, because in my opinion Gladia doesn't really get like, you're still gonna have to be forced to run metal types. It's just that these metal types won't be taking as much of significant chip. However, due to most of them, stuff like Valkyrie and Celesting already resisting Draco Beam, it's really not much of a change. Obviously, this affects more matchups offensive wise because you're not obviously just using metal types to stray hit yourself into Gladia. However, this is just pretty solid all around. Of course, the main Loomian that just gets affected by this is Arceros. Unfortunately, it is the victim of Gladia here. Arceros was never good to begin with, so this nerf was pretty undeserved. However, just keeping it in line with Gladia, because technically these two are counterparts, so I guess that does make sense in the long run. And then of course the next Loomian that we have to talk about is Soulburst Eruptodon, switching the effects of Hellstorm with Soulburst Krakaloa's Eruption. So now this is just a stab upgrade, and then Soulburst Krakaloa will now get Hellstorm. Probably the only well-deserved buff in this tier list. Obviously, Soulburst Krakaloa is nearly not as offensively oppressing to actually take advantage of Hellstorm, so the chip is most likely just going to be valued well here, which is good for Soulburst Krakaloa. However, for Soulburst Eruptodon, this heavily helps a lot of offensive or even defensive teams for that point when they're trying to use Hellstorm. You can't just have Soulburst Eruptodon as your solo wall breaker and expect to break through teams now, because Jalusa and all of that, Akalos, which it's mainly Jalusa, let's be honest, because Jalusa doesn't have the solid recovery, it's always going to be taking massive chips even if the Soulburst Eruptodon does a Hellstorm. So now that Soulburst Eruptodon has this Hellstorm effect up on the field, now being not there anymore, it definitely helps offense and defense to deal with Soulburst Eruptodon. Do I think Soulburst Eruptodon is still a very good and maybe borderline oppressive? Yes, because you're still forced to run Jalusa or Cleone or Luminami in order to deal with Soulburst Eruptodon. However, it is just a good step in the right direction. Yes, Jamiy is a conservative balancer. It makes sense of why he's taking small steps. Although Konics kind of just nullifies that. However, I won't be speaking too much on that. Next up, we have Imperior getting its ability nerfed to 50%. This is of course due to the amount of outrage from people just hating the fact that semi-stall and stall teams can just get away with removing the offensive Loomian's best wall breaker for free. However, nerfing Resentful to 50% is obviously a very good nerf for offense and defense. However, one thing I do want to mention is that this is pretty hot. This is pretty hot water, because most people don't even care about Resentful Imperior. It's mostly utilized in competitive play, and even then Imperior is not that well known. So I guess this is fair. I'd say this is mainly benefiting the competitive community part of PvP. Anyways, we do have 3 more, which I will be going over quickly now. Cosmo Unleashed, switching out surrogate ability. This is mainly due in fact that Cosmo can just, or it limits the fact that anything with a strong ability will just automatically buff Cosmo Unleashed, and of course this limits of what abilities you can put into the game. This is already borderline oppressive with Obsidian Heart and Specialization, because for people back in the day, or really wasn't that long ago, but before Atlantean Part 2, Cosmo Unleashed and Specmeor were very strong strategies, as Specialization Metatoad and Specialization Cosmo Unleashed swept through teams because you really didn't have a lot of Loomians that can just deal with that. Obviously, the conversation is once up in the air depending on whether or not that's balanced, but overall this just helps balancing a lot better because Jamiy can just put in a lot more stronger abilities for weaker stuff without worrying about Cosmo Unleashed getting those abilities with Surrogate. And of course, it really doesn't apply to any other Surrogate users like Dorgo. I just have to mention that because Dorgo doesn't have that base damage output that Cosmo Unleashed does. Of course, we have Gaststroke with Temp, which admittedly is pretty hot water type of a nerf because honestly, this meta has adapted already enough to the point where Umbrat, Vesperatu, Halvantic, all of those Loomians are just being used now to just stop Gaststroke now. Well, obviously, you also have stuff that are just running melee ice coverage at this point. Soulburst Gaststroke does get stopped by the likes of Gargoyle defense and defensive wise. Stuff that wouldn't really run provoke are now running them, like Jalusa. Obviously, that just goes to show how Gaststroke is oppressive, or like not oppressive, but game changing in this metagame. But however, would I call this somewhat, or would I call this nerf worthy? It's really up to your own interpretation. However, this is a pretty solid buff anyways, or solid nerf I should say. This just helps making team building a lot more better. And of course, it removes the fact that Soulburst Gaststroke can now sweep teams. And then finally, the nerf that we all wanted and should have got Zulong losing Fire Breath. This was teased a little months ago, I think around November or December, right after the Halloween event ended of 2023. However, this is just very good because Zulong with Fire Breath was already an issue now, but now that it lost it, stuff like Tyrex can now solidly stop this thing. So much Loomians can now stop Zulong with now that it lost Fire Breath, and overall it just helps offense a lot better because what offense was in this update with Zulong with Fire Breath is that you're pretty much forced to run a Pyrelin, or if you really want to push it, a Soulburst Gaststroke or something along those lines, because right now you can't really run something an offensive team without worrying about Zulong obviously sweeping your team. Offense basically just had to rely on boots users to outspeed a Zulong, which is very bad game balancing, and overall this is just an overall buff. So I do think that this is a pretty solid list to Jamiy's nerf of balancing lists. Of course, I do want to add a little bit more to this, specifically about Landtorch. I think Landtorch has gotten too big of a threat. However, I might make a small video on that. It really depends on what my thoughts are on it later on, but it is a new Loomian, so I do understand that. You also have a few other Loomians that are arguably, even on this list, are arguably still as bad. Specifically, I can see people making arguments for Soulburst Eruptodon and Cosmo Unleashed. And it's mainly Soulburst Eruptodon, and I guess you can count Gladia in there as well. However, overall, I think these are all solid nerfs to the main meta threats in this game. Do I think that this is a step in the right direction? Yes. Do I think that there are more steps to take? Definitely. However, Jamiy now helping his mistakes out, I think this is a pretty solid take and a pretty solid balanced list for the future. Obviously, this is all subject to change. We really don't know. These are just the guarantees that we're going to be getting. So, with that out of the way, hopefully you enjoyed the video. This is Cotton Stoops, signing off to remind you that Zulong is still a dumpster fire.